some of us have already had an opportunity to have some discussion with our special guest, Ambassador Rolf Ekéus, earlier today. But for those of you who haven't participated in the conversations earlier, it's a great honor for all of us to welcome to Harvard one of the most outstanding diplomats and operational international civil servants, really of the whole period since World War II. I watched this topic closely, or the array of topics that Rolf Ekéus' career has found him working on. And actually, we're a school that tries to study topics of this sort and study people who make a difference with respect to topics of this sort. And so we have a terrific case study in front of us here today. We've seen him here before, but we wish we would see him here more often. And we've been after him for the whole year, trying to get him here this year. But we're glad that finally Matt Messelson and several others of us managed to persuade him to come. Rolf is currently the ambassador from Sweden to the United States, a position that he's held since September of 1997. But most of us know him much more vividly from his period in the 6 years prior to that as the organizer and executive director of UNSCOM, the United Nations Special Commission for Iraq, which was given the task in the aftermath of Desert Storm, the war between the US-led coalition and Saddam Hussein, of going in and finishing the job, specifically finishing the identification and elimination of the weapons of mass destruction programs, particularly the chemical and biological and missile programs that had been pursued by Saddam Hussein prior to the war. And the assessments after the work of UNSCOM made it clear that the UN commission, run by Mr. Ekéus, actually succeeded in finding and eliminating more weapons of mass destructions and missiles than the US government's best efforts in bombing Iraq for a very substantial period. Now, the UN commissioners would not have been there doing their job had the war in Desert Storm not ended the way that it did. But that war having concluded, it was still the case that the number of missiles and the number of chemical weapons and chemical weapons production facilities and others were more significantly affected by the work of UNSCOM than after. Prior to that, he's had a very distinguished career in the Foreign Service and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden, and in the building of the international arms control systems and regimes that have constrained the spread of weapons of mass destruction, especially in the story of chemical weapons that we've been interested in here locally, but also the topic of biological weapons. So it's an extraordinary opportunity to have him here with us today, and we're going to look forward to his comments and then about both the whole story of Iraq, the sanctions, the efforts of UNSCOM, the period since UNSCOM, and after he's had a chance to offer us some remarks, we'll have a chance to put some questions to him. So please join me in welcoming Rolf Ekéus.
So thank you very much, Graham, for the introduction. Indeed, I would very much like to talk about arms control and weapons of mass destruction, and indeed I will do that also, but the focus I've been asked to work on tonight is the matter of sanctions. However, these things hang together, as you understand, at least as it has been designed by the UN Security Council. But in order to talk to that, I have to remind you about some of the historical background, and then the discussion can focus in a way which will avoid us from going over old stuff too much. So first remind you of what the region we are talking about. We are talking about the Gulf region. And the first thing that falls into one's mind, especially if one is a Westerner, it is that there 2/3 of the world's known oil reserves are situated, and so is 1/3 of the world known reserves of natural gas. There are states there, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, which are Arabic states with maybe rather doubtful democratic legitimacy, but with normally quite a good economy, which make up maybe for the deficit in democracy. They're taking well care of their citizens with great revenues from the oil exports. They are, first of all, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Bahrain, Qatar, Emirates, and Oman. These are Arabic states. They are run by Sunni Arabs. And they are, as we said, non-aggressive. Maybe, oddly enough, Kuwait, which was the one with the probably weakest democratic record, after the war is now the one which is doing, I think, best of them all in trying to bring in democracy as an important component in the running country. But there are also two others, less peaceful, less soft, if I may say so. They are Iran and Iraq, of course. And these two are striving to extend spheres of influence in the region, and they are in a definite competitive relationship. It goes without saying about the resources I mentioned that the West cannot ignore developments in the Gulf. And I come back to that. But that means also that West have to address developments. Early on, you recall the recently written about the coup in Iran when the Shah was introduced as an alternative to the Mossadegh regime, which was tended to nationalize the Iranian oil resources. The Shah was put in place as an important policeman in the Gulf. The United States and the West backed that regime. Also, there were some, I guess, the Brits, the French to some degree, also were trying to back up Iraq, which had, as you know, its own revolution, a socialist Ba'ath Party revolution throwing out the Hashemite kingdom, and that changed Iraq from the rather, I would say, soft country also into a much harder player. However, the affair with Iran finished with the Islamic Revolution 78 and the traumatic experience, especially for the United States, linked to the embassy occupation there, made also U.S. to look anew on the Gulf. When Iraq started its aggression in 1980, I will come back in a little more detail to that also, attacked Iran, the U.S. and the West threw its support behind Iraq, disregarding the obvious fact that it was an outright aggression led by the Saddam Hussein and the group around him. This event underlined the instability in the region. It had to do with Iran, first of all, as a non-Arabic player with a Shia system, Shia Islamic group, which was at that stage quite aggressive, we have to recall, in its language. The Saudi leadership, the royal family, Sunni family, was accused of being unworthy of custodians of the holy mosque and the mosques, and they were challenged very vigorously by Iran. So were all the small Sunni Arabic states. They were felt threatened by the Iranian Islamic Revolution. Some of them, as case in Bahrain, had even a majority of Shia, and also indeed, as a matter of fact, Iraq has a majority of Shia Arabs. So it can be explained that there was a general sense of threat when this new regime came into place, and that can to some degree explain the Iraqi attack on Iran. I can say it was a preemptive. Iraq can explain that as a preemptive action. Iraq at that occasion, at late 70s, was a prosperous country. After the two major events, when the oil price was risen, one happened 73 and another price hike in 78. It was flooded with cash. It had a thriving middle class developed over the years with considerable cultural elements, literature, poetry especially, and a generally good academic and educational standard. It was also, and is still, a blessed country with two rivers. Water is a rare commodity, as you know, in that region, and that was, of course, a pillar of strength for the country, and a hardworking and well-educated population. So the war against Iran was, and the attack on Iran in that background turned out to be a catastrophe for Iraq. And that is, I think, the big calamity we must keep in mind when we talk about today's Iraq. The soldiers, it started the war in 80 and finished in August 88. 8 years of war. One doesn't need much fantasy to understand it. It was not a low-level attrition war. It was a serious, major conflict with daily operations, and the attrition was terrible on both sides, especially on Iraq, where there are hundreds of thousands, I would say some 200 soldier boys were killed or maimed. And the economy, imagine 8 years of warfare, an economy with a decent developing industrial standards, with a good functioning agriculture, with the process of building and maintaining infrastructure, roads, electricity, water supply, and so on, and the rising level of education and the rising quality of the academia. All these things were challenged during this war, 8-year war. And because the country changed itself into war footing, which meant buying firearms, artillery, tanks, aircraft, MiGs and Mirage, bombs, missiles, and munition in incredible amount. Not only buying, producing internally, changing the whole infrastructure into support of the war, into the support of the war effort, halting civilian work, and making the country a country of a major belligerent, put in a major belligerent status. In addition to these things, the leadership in Iraq started a multi-billion-dollar program on producing nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, trying to acquire, I would say, starting programs for nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, and missiles of long-range character. This added to the cost, of course, and in parallel became a brutalization of the whole society, a brutalization not only against also the political character, but broad recklessness and disregard for the value of human life. The use of chemical weapons, one of the most terrible examples of that. We know that because the incident of major incident of attacking Kurdish population in Halabja with chemical warfare is one example. Another and a repeat example was towards the end of the conflict with Iran when Iraq applied chemical warfare to the battlefield situation through bombs and artillery. The effects on the Iranian side, which were totally unprotected, the kids with very poor weaponry, with bad discipline, not well organized in military formations, was devastating, and the Iraqi leadership at least judges, and I will come back to that, this warfare, chemical weapons, as a military success, because that really made the difference in the conflict. Maybe one can discuss that from pure military terms, but if you add the psychological and political effect by the chemical warfare, it is clear. As a footnote, a diplomatic footnote, we can say that the reaction to the use of chemical weapons in Libya, and also the reaction to the use of chemical weapons in the battlefield was lukewarm, to say the least, in the West. We know Iraq is or was a party to the Geneva Protocol 25 prohibiting the use of chemical weapons. But because of the convenience and the tilting, the political convenience and the tilting in favor of Iraq, the international reaction was close to zero. We can discuss that also later on. But there one can see how principles sometimes have to give in for expediency. The war ended in August 88 with, I would say, mutual exhaustion, even if it's with a slight maybe advantage for Iraq. The Iranians had not the heart in it anymore to carry out the war after these tremendous blows. And that brought Iraq into a situation where he got some minor geographical addition, something they have lost since then. But it's much worse. The country ended the war with its own resources depleted. A tremendous debt. First of all the cash flow from the oil export had been used for pursuing the conventional war, and a tremendous debt burden had been built up. First of all, Saudi Arabia and Kuwait carried the greatest burden of financing the war, but also the West, especially France, gave large credits for the MiG export and for the Mirage export and other things, and Russia even more gave considerable credits for buying missiles, Scud missiles, and the MiGs. So the country, one can say simply and squarely, was in an economic ruin. And the social costs were tremendous also. It had hit the middle class, the total war effort, which was a total war effort, ruined the middle class really. And the 8 years is a terrible time when you carry out war. also robbed it very much of the entrepreneurial spirit. Large number of businessmen, engineers, technicians had left the country, and many ended up here, as a matter of fact, in the United States, but also in the West, in many other places. The country was in a desperate situation in 1988, when the war ended. But Saddam, a man with such a quick mind, he saw the situation. He saw very little could be done immediately, and he decided to take the quick fix. Why not take Kuwait, which is richness, which swimming in oil, and a country which also had this debt demand on it, and simply assimilate Kuwait. Iraq had never really recognized Kuwait as a state, felt it was just a construction of the colonial powers, so it fit into the overall philosophy also, so he had a good rationale for doing it. The attack, we all remember that, took place in August 19, this fateful August in our history. And the immediate response to that was, now we're coming to the subject matter, the sanctions decided upon by the Security Council. The sanctions were, in very simple terms, a prohibition to buy goods from Iraq. That was, of course, an oil embargo, and a prohibition to sell, to export anything to Iraq, with the exception of food and medicine. Food and medicine were never prohibited commodities. We know then the debate, or some of us remember, some of you probably not, but we remember the debate, some of us, in the autumn 1990, after the August invasion, where it was a matter of force, military force, or let sanctions work. And many of us, and I must include myself, were, saying, let sanctions work. That's a peaceful way. That's a way to avoid bloodshed. So we supported, the sanctions idea to bring Iraq to its senses. However, we all know that this idea did not prevail. A coalition was assembled. Iraq was thrown out of Kuwait and soundly defeated. It was a major success for the US and for Saudi Arabia, who were the two leaders of the coalition. And the interesting thing was then, when the ceasefire situation entered, and it was a matter to lay down the rules for the ceasefire, the coalition decided to hand over that task to the United Nations. It was, when we now today see the bashing of United Nations, we see that a very interesting event. That was a belief at that time that UN was the body. And partly it was, I guess, because the UN had been the forum and had been the place where the coalition had been assembled successfully. So the UN, the Security Council, outlined the ceasefire arrangement. And we shouldn't go through all the details there, but for our purposes, it is enough to say that the sanctions were kept in place. The oil embargo was kept there, and it was linked to the weapons issue. The concern during the war had grown about Iraq's capabilities with regard to the weapons of mass destruction and the long-range missiles. So it was decided, why not to link the two, the sanctions and the weapons issue. So in its wisdom, the Security Council decided that Iraq should declare declare its holdings, not only weapons, but production capabilities of such items, nuclear chemical, biological weapons and missiles with a range above 150 kilometers. Not only these, but also the production capability and components of such weapons. These things should be declared and indeed eliminated. If that was done, the oil embargo, which was kept from the earlier resolution, 678 resolution, now into 687, it's easy just to switch the two last numbers to remember that. The 687 was kept intact, and we have to understand the situation in 1991, spring 91. There was a major concern about the energy security of the West, and the oil price, and also concern about the oil prices. It was an interest to assure the international community that the oil would flow back to the world market, and but on the other side, it was a little tricky to allow that to happen immediately after Saddam Hussein and the leadership had so obviously broken the rules and principles of international law and international living together. So it was an elegant fix. It was felt at that time the Iraq would be then offered the possibility to get its oil back very quickly, and the accompanying relief necessary consequence of the oil embargo lifted of the sanctions. However, we have to recall that also the issue of food and medicine was still open. Iraq was allowed to import that, but what did that help if there were no money to buy such commodities? However, that was the deal. And the reasoning was the combination of carrot and stick, an element of punishment, an element of pressure, but also encouragement. If Iraq did the right thing, Iraq would quickly come back to the international community, back to the markets, back into its former affluency. So this was the idea. Very quickly, however, problems appeared, and there was obvious disappointment with Iraqi willingness or unwillingness rather to work with the new regime that was set up, this inspection regime, UNSCOM, which had the responsibility to supervise the identification and destruction of Iraq's capabilities. So the Security Council met in the summer '91 and decided to introduce an oil for food scheme. That is, Iraq was allowed to sell oil for a given amount, and for all that money, Iraq was free to buy food and medicine. The UN, the Council also decided that this food and medicine should be distributed by UN agencies and by the organization. And that was probably why Iraq refused to go along with that arrangement. So, and secondly, as I said, very quickly we saw there was no deal on the weapons. And there one can immediately inquire why it was so. Well, the Iraqi explanations were simple. They had now the experience from the war with Iran. They understood that for Iraq, a 20+ million people country, to fight along a war of attrition with a country, Iran, 60+ million people, the long-term prospects were not good. And the depth of Iraqi human resources and of Iranian human resources and Iranian capabilities were such that the long-term conventional conflict with Iran would probably necessarily lead to a defeat. And we had still an Iran with its ambitions, with its pressure on the Arabic states. So Iraq, according to its own explanations, decided to do anything to keep the weapons of mass destruction. That was the only way they could equalize, or think still today, equalize the conventional superiority on the Iranian side. And that, as it has been explained to me many times over, the blame for destabilizing the region was then put on the United Nations with the following reasoning. Well, the Iranians are the ones who are the revolution. They would like to throw out the Saudis. They would like to take control of the whole Gulf region and the oil and energy there, and also over the Arabs. And we have this eternal struggle between Persians and Arabs. And history has placed Iraq as the frontline state against the Persians, the front line of the Arabs, and the gatekeeper of the Arabic nation. How to serve? To serve as a gatekeeper, the only way, the only means available for that were the weapons of mass destruction. Iraq could not guarantee to hold back the Iranian combined military and ideological offensive. And therefore, the UN, the United Nations, took upon itself a tremendous responsibility by refusing Iraq from having these equalizers, these weapons which could balance off Iran. And in that sense, UN seriously disturbed and undermined the security for the Arabs in the Gulf. So we had a series of controversies about the weapons. Iraq insisted in various forms and ways, and we are not to discuss that, at least in my initial presentation. We entered into a situation where, however, the social problems with the sanctions became more and more apparent. And that was something which was felt in the international community and, of course, among the members of the Security Council. And the United Nations started to try to change the game and make the possibility, the willingness of Iraq to participate in an arrangement to bring food to the Iraqi people. Saddam refused all the time, but after a renegotiation during '96, a new system was put in place in the beginning of '97, which meant that Iraq was allowed to sell quite large quantities of oil. The money for that oil should be put into UN escrow account, and from that Iraq could draw as much as it wanted for food and medicine. That was roughly the old scheme, but more money in play. But what was new was that the distribution of these capabilities were given to Iraq. So Iraq was to distribute, and UN should have quite a loose control of it. And that was, I think, a very poor negotiation from the UN side, as it has shown itself. The system has now been working since '97, and what we see is that it has been slow in starting. It is now functioning reasonably well. Food and medicine is coming in, but the distribution in large part of Iraq is not functioning well. It appears that the distribution is based upon political criteria set by Saddam Hussein. In one area, the north, the Kurdish area, there the Iraqi authorities have no play at all. So there the distribution is handled by the United Nations, and the relative quantities are the same, but it is clear that it has been a great success in the Kurdish areas. And the living standard there is now back to the pre-war situation, and is, we see, most promising development and most encouraging development in that area. But where Iraq is controlling, still there are hardships, especially in the south, where the Shia Muslims, Arab Shia Muslims, are living, and the majority, I have to add, of the population having still a very difficult time. And there we are today with the sanctions. Iraq is still refusing to make any formal deal. Iraq has given up its trust on, they say at least, on the UN. They believe that or Saddam believes that no matter what, there will be no full lifting or easing of the sanctions until he is removed. And that is not in his interest, so he sees no value in a deal with the international community. So he insists on, from that point of view, here's another good reason, that is that UN still demands an elimination of complete accountancy, if I say so, and elimination of the prohibited capabilities with regard to weapons. However, we can see the humanitarian problems now in Iraq, and how can we, what can one do with that? And I think that is a tremendous dilemma the international community is facing, and especially the Security Council, because there has been some developments. The Council has decided in its recent resolution 1284 in late last year to take away all ceilings for Iraq's oil export. So Iraq is now allowed to export as much as it can, as much as the market tolerates. And still the rule is that the funds generated by that export are to be put into an escrow account. That is the rule today. And food and medicine and also some other commodities are admitted. But still fundamentally dual-use items, advanced machines, machine tools, chemicals, sensitive pharmaceutical and technology is denied. All these things are denied for Iraq. So the question, but still the system works reasonably well now, at least almost, I think the food is probably enough even for the whole population, but still there are problems because of the poor distribution, very deliberately so, in large parts of Iraq. So the question is, shall one, in face of these problems, lift the sanctions? And the question is a very difficult one, because if you think about what does it mean, lift the sanctions? It means that the control of the oil revenues, how they are used, will be lifted from the UN. And it will be, that means that all the resources will be put in the hands of the present leadership of Iraq, Saddam Hussein. He has already demonstrated his attitude with regard to the distribution, but even worse, he has demonstrated the priority he gives to acquiring weapons of mass destruction. And for me, at least, and I think an honest investigation and thinking makes it very difficult to believe that all the oil money which now goes to Iraqi people in form of food, medicine, some material for oil exploration, and some humanitarian goods, that all that would continue to go to Iraqi people if Saddam is allowed to take care of it. I would venture the proposition to say that very little will go to them. And we will look into a situation where at least a new hardship will be suffered by the Iraqi people. It is therefore, I must say, the matter of sanctions is a matter, how crude and it may sound, a matter of Saddam Hussein and his policies. I'm really sad to say that. It looks like awful prospects for the Iraqi people, but I can't imagine a situation where he would change the situation to the better from the situation as it is now. But if one can make that believable, I promise you that the Council would, with open arms, accept that if they really were convinced that this was something which we could get out of this dilemma. The only, as I see it, the deal which remains is the deal which the Secretary General, also Kofi Annan, has been working on, namely that bring the inspection back, they are out now, the inspection system, establish a very tough, effective weapons control again of Iraq. That is, I think, a solution, maybe an offered solution, and lift allow Iraq to import the dual-use items, which would make, even if there are sensitive chemicals and machine tools, equipment, parts, and so on, they would be, the inspection system would guarantee that these weapons commodities will not be used for WMD purposes. That is a chance. I would say it has less than a 50% chance, but it may be worth trying. That means that, first of all, one had to have some belief in arms control. I have belief in arms control. I think it's doable. But secondly, it demands also that Saddam Hussein changes his priorities from what he had during the 8 years war against Iran and during the years up till after the war, from acquiring, first of all, weapons of mass destruction, and secondly, taking care of his people. And that is a doubtful proposition, of course. So the question is, maybe one should try it, maybe one should not try it. I think one should try it, but it doesn't look like the Council today is in the position to do it. So.
We thank Ralph very much for such a broad tour of the horizon. Let me suggest the ground rules here. There are microphones on either side so people can hear. So this gentleman, your hand's up, just come on down. And what we'll have is questions or short comments. Comments, especially points of disagreement, are welcome, indeed encouraged, not for their own sake, but if you have a strong argument to make, don't be bashful about that. But do be brief and identify yourself in the first instance. This gentleman in the green.
Yes, hello. Thank you. My name is George Capaccio. I've traveled to Iraq many times in the last 3 years. I work actively against the sanctions, and I am shocked and saddened by the position that you have put forth, and I regret that many of the people here are going to be misinformed and misled by what you lay out. There's so much that I can't go into detail because we don't have time, information that you have left out, or you have put in a certain way that I can read James Rubin's spends from the State Department that pretty much are consistent with what you're saying. No mention at all of the U.S. role in arming Iraq in the 1980s. No mention at all of how George Bush and his fellow colleagues twisted the UN to get the coalition in 1990. And no mention in the international laws broken by that coalition in waging and prosecuting the Gulf War, in using weapons of mass destruction, such as the cluster bombs, the fuel air explosives, napalm, etc. No mention of the 1 million, at least 1 million people who have died as a direct result of the sanctions. No mention at all of the illegality and the immorality of these sanctions. No mention of all of the suffering that people have endured under this policy, being held hostage in contradiction to the norms of the UN Charter, the principles of the UN Charter, and the holding of this entire people, 23 million people. I noticed in your opening, one of you said the U.S.-led coalition against Saddam Hussein. Well, it was the U.S. coalition against 23 million people. Let's not forget that. We didn't target particularly, we targeted a whole people, a whole country. Their electrical grid, their water power treatment plants, their sewage plants, all in violation of international law, I might add. We have also violated the Geneva Convention in maintaining and going after all kinds of facilities that protect a people. We bomb livestock, we bomb the vaccine plant, the one and only, the milk factory. We continue to bomb Iraq about every 3 days. Just last week on May 17th, a 4-year-old child was killed in Basra. You didn't mention that. You didn't mention the fact that before 1990, Iraq still maintained a relatively high standard of living, that in fact it socialized the country and provided a decent health care system, a decent educational system, that in this country, our great palace is the Pentagon. Half of our federal budget goes to creating weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and nuclear. No mention of Israel that we know has about 200 thermonuclear warheads. No mention of the chemical and biological stockpiles in Israel. No mention of the Turkey invasions.
I think we got the line of argument.
Well, yeah, we're talking about genocide here, and you're talking about a policy that is the best of all possible worlds.
Would you like to comment on any elements of this?
No, but I think, first of all, I said most what was stated here because I pointed out the West supported Iraq. Well, I pointed out that West was supporting Iraq. I pointed out the matter of the hardship and the suffering of the Iraqi people. But because I didn't have the time to develop all aspects of it, the living standard, however, a very important point that we disagree, and I think I have the facts very strong on my side, is the big difference happened when Iraq attacked Iran in 1980. That was when the living standard went from an excellent living standard, as I outlined, the high quality, relatively high quality of life, to this disastrous 8-year war. And maybe it was Iraqi people that carried out that war, but it had a leader who led them into that war. Personally, I think that it was very much the charismatic leadership of Saddam Hussein that brought them into that. Maybe it was the nation which carried the war. At least the nation took the suffering from under this leadership. That is important. Of course, then the quick fix attacked Kuwait and the atrocities against Kuwaiti people, which had nothing but peaceful intentions and what had been backing Iraq all through the war, happened, and the sanctions stayed on. As I said, I guess many of us who are sympathetic to Iraq were, as I said, arguing in favor of keeping the sanctions as an alternative to military warfare. Of course, we now know that Iraq had other priorities. We know that from the beginning Iraq could get relief from the oil embargo very early on. It was a matter of 6 months, according to judgments, my own judgment and others, for Iraq just to say, all right, we don't have the ambition to keep these weapons. And why should any country, why should we support an ambition to have biological weapons? If anyone can imagine the consequences of biological warfare, why should we support Iraq to keep such weapons? No civilized country is demanding that. The same goes for chemical weapons. Chemical weapons are outlawed by the international community. Why should we back Iraq to have chemical weapons? There is no excuse for that. And I think the situation is such that the Iraqi people has to make up its mind. If they think it's a good piece of affair, they could continue that, or if they prefer something else, they have to do something else. So I think this is very important. The Israeli situation and others, of course, we have a very unstable situation around the whole region now. We hope that the Middle East peace process will yield results, And I think personally that would be very important. That would probably help a lot in sorting out also problems in the Gulf. But it is a difficult situation indeed. Thank you.
Okay, this gentleman on the right.
Yeah, my name is Pina Jimion. I'm MPP1 in the Kennedy School. So my question is the following. You just said that the Iraqi people have to make up their mind. Are the Iraqis people who are right now suffering due to the embargo responsible for what Saddam Hussein is doing? Everybody agrees that Saddam Hussein is a bloody dictator who used chemical weapon in '88 against the Kurds. But why the Iraqis people have to suffer this embargo, which killed 1 million people, if you quote Ramsey Clark, former Attorney General, or if you quote the UNICEF, is another question. Is this embargo a price worth paying? Some people, just to quote Madeleine Albright and to rephrase it, in one of the talks she made in 1997, she said that the 587,000 children who died because of the embargo was a price worth paying. It might be the case, but I'm wondering.
Exactly. I'm very grateful for that question. You helped me very much with that, and I tried to answer it, but I will answer it again. The situation is now exactly, Iraqi people is suffering. It is, there are some slight improvements because of the relief, but they are still suffering. All right, what is the answer? Lift embargo. What will happen then? What does the lifting embargo mean? It means that you put all the money into the hands of the present leadership. We have to accept that just now Saddam Hussein is the president of the country, the leader of the country, and he decides, no one else, he decides how these resources should be made. If you believe, and I would be very happy that Saddam, if the embargo would be lifted, would use all his resources, all these resources, to help his people through immediate starting the economy going and running, instead of bringing into new aggressive operation, or because then I think it would be quite easy to follow. But the problem is he is not credible. I think that is, I totally agree with you. I mean, but how can we lift the embargo and how can we hand all that money over to that person? I don't have confidence in him. You don't have confidence in him. So that is a tragedy. That's a dilemma. As academics and intellectuals, we must recognize this terrible dilemma we are in. It's awful. And
could I just add one concern? Like after the Gulf War and after having fight for 8 years against Iran, the Iraqis received something like 7.5 equivalent of Hiroshima on their countries. So one way, a bombing equivalent of 7.5 Hiroshimas. One way for them to develop would be to 7.5 Hiroshimas. Sorry. One way for them to develop would be to rebuild the infrastructure, water plant, wastewater plant, because one of the main problems right now is Iraq is that the water is not drinkable, there's no wastewater plant. So, and this problem is not faced by the UN, nothing is done. I mean, this is like the reason why children are suffering in Iraq.
But that is, unfortunately, the lack of trust in his intentions, but I agree with you. These are things which have to be done. Water purification, electricity going and so on. But that is what the modest plan I proposed contain. Allow strict control of dual-use items, allow the country to import all these items, but see to it that they are not misused. And there are schemes. UNSCOM had a fully operational plan which dealt with that, but UNSCOM doesn't exist anymore.
But I'm somewhat ignorant of this, but on the question, is the current sanction regime prevent the import of material that would improve the water system?
There is now gradually easing up on that, so of course.
You need chemicals to clean water.
Yes.
You need chlorine. And if you're afraid that Saddam Hussein is going to build this chemical
it is
weapon,
not enough.
you
I agree.
can't do anything.
It's not little is going on, but I agree it's not enough.
Please identify yourself.
Hi, my name is Shadi Spiegelman. I'm a Kennedy School student and I'm from Israel. My question is a more broad question. We all agree that the sanction policy failed to coerce Saddam to change his ways. And I was wondering, from your experience, how would this affect other sanctions in different regions of the world if it's not working, and why do we keep using it? Angola, now Ethiopia, and other places. And what's the sense of using them if they're not working?
The sanctions or?
Sanctions policy in general, yeah.
Well, they are working. That is a problem, in a sense. I mean, the oil embargo is a very effective system because some oil is smuggled out through Iranian waterways, through Turkey, and that oil, the funds for that goes direct to the leadership in Baghdad. However, the big bulk of the export is, I would say, so-called legal. And all the money are paid into the escrow account. And there is nothing hidden there. All that money is distributed for food and medicine. And some reparations, of course, to the
UN agencies.
Yes, but no UN agency. Yes, but the UN agency cost is totally insignificant. I mean, it's not the promille you talk about. But let us talk about reparation. That's correct. It's going back to the victims of the aggression by, if I say not Iraqi people, but by Iraq against its neighbor. So that is a part of the arrangement on the UN. I think in UN operation in Geneva, which is calculating the reparation and the money. So that is going back. That's true. UNSCOM costs nothing, practically. And Iraq is insisting even giving it more.
Pay for out of that escrow account.
Yeah, but it is nothing. It's just a fraction of a promille.
How do the UNSCOM people live in Baghdad? Could you tell us that history?
There is no UNSCOM people in Baghdad. They no, but all right, but they have no word about. They live very modestly, I can assure you.
I'm sorry. When they meant they failed, I didn't mean you can. I know they can export oil. I mean they didn't succeed in
everything.
Yeah, I mean they didn't succeed in coercing Saddam to do what you want. That's what I meant when I failed. Not that you can close Iraq from exporting. I meant their purpose wasn't achieved. So why would we put sanctions in different regions of the world if other leaders, and we have like 7 or 8 places in the world that are having sanctions, I'm not sure. Why would the Security Council keep putting economic sanctions if it doesn't?
There are 2 reasons. One is to prevent Iraq from acquiring biological, chemical, nuclear capabilities, which they have demonstrated. If I say not Iraqi people, Iraq and its leadership has demonstrated it is prepared to use in the most reckless fashion. I think we have to remind ourselves there is nothing humane in allowing Iraq to gas its own population, to attack its neighbors, to use biological warfare, including viruses, which at least they try to. I'm not quite sure they will succeed, but they have been working hard on that, and other agents. So first, that is the one problem, number one. Prevent that. And Iraq has not been prepared to give up that option. Point number 2, again, is where is the money going now, and where will it go if the embargo is lifted? It will. That is the problem, and the dilemma is there. I mean, it's wonderful to have an easy solution, but you have no easy solution. None of us so far I've heard have. I have no easy solution, and no one else so far has given me any solution.
Thank you.
The general question, I'll just make a small comment on it, is an interesting one, just on the general use of sanctions as instruments. There's a quite good piece by Richard Haas on sanctions madness, which suggests that American governments in particular sanction people left, right, and in the morning and at night frequently because the question is there's a problem and somebody wants to do something. And so sanctions appear to be doing something. There's not generally a very good assessment or evaluation of them, and so a government can pretend to itself that it's doing something, even though frequently the objective which is initially announced is not accomplish. I think Rolf's argument in this instance, if I hear, is that while the sanctions haven't been successful in achieving all of the purposes, some more limited objectives have been accomplished. I think Haas's study suggests that most frequently the sanctions are mostly occasions for sort of pounding one's fist or something, but either are counterproductive or basically have very little effect. But that doesn't keep the U.S. from putting them on regularly, as you mentioned, in a whole bunch of other cases, not to mention just the Iraqi case, which is just one instance.
I will give you a bet that Haas is not recommending the lifting the sanctions on Iraq.
No. Well, that's an interesting one. Yes. Please, Mr.
My name is Wells Williams, and I actually traveled to Iraq myself for 2 weeks a year ago, and I actually saw firsthand the effects of the economic sanctions on the people of Iraq when I toured the hospitals and the schools and talked to people on the street. And they're not, something that people pound their fists about. They're something that children die about. I think it's very serious and should be taken very seriously. I also want to report to our speaker that a month ago, actually 2 weeks ago, the director of the Food for Oil program, Hans von Spunnick, who just resigned to protest the Security Council sanctions, reported that the amount of aid going to the north had nothing to do with the fact that Saddam Hussein controlled it, had to do with the fact that there's more money per capita going to the north, and there's a lot more smuggling, or actually trade, not going through the UN, through the border with the U.S. ally of Turkey. And he also reported that he took up the challenge of these charges of stockpiling and unfair distribution and studied it with his crew of UN people and found that 91.7% of everything that had been delivered to Iraq had also been delivered to its endpoint destinations. He did this with a comprehensive review of all the stock reports to refute the charges by the U.S. State Department. So, with those two corrections, I actually want to ask you a question about your expertise of disarmament, and I would like to ask you, how do you feel there could be ever any kind of serious consideration by Iraq of international disarmament when UN Resolution 687 called for the weapons inspections and disarmament of Iraq in the context of regional disarmament, which is not proceeding and not going on as Iraq's neighbors are armed to the teeth, and also after U.S. agents working through UNSCOM are later revealed as spies who provide information for the targeting of U.S. bombs on Iraq. How is Iraq ever going to take the UN and the U.S.'s role in the UN credibly or seriously? Are they going to be realistic and say this country has a double standard?
On the first point, von Spunnick has, of course, very good reasons to explain why his operation didn't succeed, why it succeeded in the Kurdish area. The quantities were has been counted equally population-wise. The distribution is done by the United Nations, not by his operation. But his operation has not succeeded because yourself is witness to the hardship of the people. But the calorie intake, everything is calculated reasonably fair, and it should not be that bad if it has not been manipulated. Von Spunnick's operation is partly a failure. Now we take it one. Then going to the paragraph 14, which you referred to, the weapons issue. Paragraph 14 is a paragraph that says that this weapon inspection and arrangements to get rid of the weapons of mass destruction would hopefully be, I paraphrase, a step towards the zone free from weapons of mass destruction in the whole region. They are not exact what they mean, but in the region, which is an elaboration of the Mubarak plan. And indeed, that is correct, and I think this is a very good position, but it meant, of course, that one should start with Iraq, as I understand the resolution, and I think if you read it carefully, you will probably agree with me on this. As I indicated in my speech, I referred to that by saying if we have progress in the Middle East process, in the Israeli-Syrian, Lebanon trail and on the Israeli-Palestinian trail, things will open up probably that would probably possible to include the Middle East. I'm quite optimistic about that. Maybe I'm naive, but I think good prospects if we succeed with that. Finally, bombs and spying. I think the targets in Iraq, maybe they are spies, but so it is in all warfare, so far I know. If you refer that UN had been involved in any spying.
Right, they were. Right, U.S. agents working for
Well, what knowledgeable people we have here. It's interesting to hear more. They can tell me afterwards about all the things they know. It's clear that what I think people believe is that the production facilities in Iraq, where chemical weapons, missile production was going on, shorter range permitted production according to the resolution. These were targets by the, I think, US, and they used their own parameters. I don't know why they should need spies in that sense. They were notoriously well-known places which were attacked.
Richard Butler documented this and said that, yes, people who were working for him released information to the US and Britain, and they used it for their targeting.
Well, I don't know.
Buildings to decide where the bombs should most accurately be dropped.
Well, he knows what he did, but I didn't know that. I don't know that, and I don't confirm it, and I doubt it.
Thank you. Azim Sutawala, doing a Master's here in Middle Eastern Studies. I've got 2 points to make, sir, if you'd let me. The first one, I think I actually have a magic solution for lifting the sanctions, but you're going to have to help me out here. So, during the 1980s, who supplied the majority of chemical weapons to Iraq? Which countries?
Well, against chemical weapons.
Chemical weapons.
Chemical weapons.
Please, he'll answer.
Well, we can have another.
Please, sir, if you could
others
answer.
will answer. Now I am asked, so allow me. I don't think chemical weapons were delivered.
Sorry, chemical agents, things which are produced. You know what I mean.
Not chemical weapons agents,
Okay,
but
sure.
because chemicals were delivered to Iraq for the purpose of producing pesticides,
Who was?
insecticides.
Sure, okay.
Allow me to answer.
Okay, of course.
Or is that prohibited? And fertilizers, chemicals which can well be used also as precursors, certain at least in weapons production. So indeed, chemicals were.
Which countries predominantly?
Probably one could fault these governments or these countries.
Which governments, sir? Which governments? That's the question. I don't mind about the rest of the stuff. I know about that, but which governments?
And I don't want to name names, but I would say the West. The West, all
the US, Germany, France, Britain. I mean, that's what you mean by the West. I mean, the West is a very large term. I assume that's what you mean.
Let me explain in more detail. Technology during the 80s, West was very generous in delivering advanced equipment to Iraq, and I think sometimes without careful consideration of the end user. There was always a story about the peaceful.
So, sir, let me stop you. Sorry, let me stop you. I have a solution.
Yeah, but
I have a solution. I mean, if you lift the sanctions, but you prevent countries which are supplying the agents for weapons of mass destruction, surely then you save the lives of Iraqi children and all the suffering, all the madness which is going on in Iraq at the moment. But you actually can lift the sanctions and prevent Saddam Hussein from, having weapons of mass destruction. I mean, is that too simple? I think that's a price worth paying.
When it took the agreement, that is exactly what I proposed.
There you go. There's a great solution.
Yeah, that was what I proposed in my speech.
Okay, good.
If you allow me then to repeat that you didn't hear it.
Please.
I said, first of all, up till late 80, there were deliveries from the West. Then a certain nervousness set in, and including the missile technology control regime started to work. There was coordination. So it was, they started dry up. Iraq then turned to Far East, and I won't mention name countries there also, but some countries in the East delivered, especially on the chemical not weapons, but again, material for chemical
I thought that wasn't your policy. I thought you wanted to keep the sanctions.
And also then concerning weapons, the Scuds, the missiles were delivered from the then Soviet Union, as we know, and from Eastern Europe, some Eastern European countries, that were delivered material for improving the missiles, gyroscopes, guidance systems.
Not the chemical agents, which are missiles are not weapons
from the East and technology from the West.
Sure. Okay, so at least we've agreed on a solution. That's good. So you are in favor of lifting the sanctions?
I agree. My proposal was that one should stop all deliveries of sensitive material which are not controlled by inspectors.
And then lift the
Because
sanctions.
we need to give Iraq chemicals. Iraq needs lots of chemicals.
Good.
But we should have inspection system which guarantees that these chemicals.
Good. And just on my second point, quickly, briefly, if you permit me, how would you respond to comments by people like President Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright, who say that categorically, I mean, they've been quoted on record as saying that the sanctions will remain in place till Saddam Hussein is removed from power? Now, I mean, I assume that the US has a big influence in the United Nations. I think it does. So how would you respond to that, and what kind of impact
there is a clear disagreement on that. The United Nations and the General and the leaders of the inspections of what they're talking about, they can only follow appropriate decisions. There is no decision by the Security Council or any other, by the Security Council, which is a decision-making body, of any such arrangement. It's a policy statement from individuals in the United States, the US leadership, but that is not supported by the United Nations. There is no resolution supporting that.
Okay, so does that have any implications for United Nations policy, those statements, at all?
We have, for instance, the Congress has decided on $97 million for, getting rid of changing leadership in Iraq. That is, of course, not endorsed by the United Nations. The United Nations is not backing that. The United Nations is just backing the simple elimination of weapons.
Thank you.
This gentleman on the right.
My name is Nathaniel Hurd. I'm a research analyst at the Boston Research Group. Well, I'd love to have a conversation about the historical record regarding the exemption of food and medicine, the effectiveness of the Oil for Food program. Your field of expertise is disarmament, and so I will confine my question to that. In the 1999 30th March report put out by the Specially Commissioned Disarmament Panel, the panel concluded in paragraph 27 that both UNSCOM and IAEA have been adopting a pragmatic approach which assumes that 100% of verification may be an unattainable goal. As of right now, Iraq is held to a standard of 100% quantitative disarmament, quantitative, not qualitative. That means that a lot of these very well-publicized incidents of UNSCOM inspectors banging on doors, asking to be let in, they were not actually looking for fully assembled weapons. They were looking for nuts, they were looking for bolts, the equivalent thereof, blueprints, etc., etc. Given that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction infrastructure was largely destroyed, or its destruction was verified by UNSCOM, given that UNSCOM had a very rigorous monitoring program in place that Iraq was actually being relatively compliant with, do you not think that now the time has come to change the criteria so that Iraq is now held up to a criteria of qualitative disarmament as opposed to quantitative disarmament? And if I can add an amendment to that, do you think that changing the criteria would make it far more likely that Iraq would accept future monitoring? They accepted it before. They accepted the resolutions that laid out monitoring. They accepted Resolution 1051, which laid out the import-export regime. If that change takes place, will we see, in your estimation, a break in the impasse that we currently see? Because, again, Iraq is held up to that standard of 100% quantitative disarmament.
Well, I like that question. I agree practically on everything you say. Maybe on the philosophical issue of 100%. And what is, if you say not 100%, then what do you mean? you open up for.
Well, in other words, if you.
But it's only a little philosophical quarrel. It is not substantive quarrel, but I mean, it opens up for zero. I mean, so the question is simply, how should one be reasonable? And I think you are right. One should be reasonable here. And I think one cannot absolutely guarantee total, and one shouldn't, if one put into place what you referred to, the import-export mechanism, which will control things. But what the good news in that sense is that the new resolution 1284, which you probably studied also, if you know the other resolutions so well,
I know them well,
is not really taking this 100% issue, as 687 talked about all the capabilities. And it's not for an individual to say it should not be all, it should be almost all. So, you know, but it has to do with political sense. And I agree with you. I think one cannot demand fully, but I wouldn't like to say 100%. I don't want to use the word philosophically. But 1284 now indicates that doesn't speak about remnants at all. The resolution just refers to the old 687, and indirectly it can say it refers to. The 1284 talks about what you indicated, a monitoring of Iraq's capabilities, that they don't activate them, that there is no major no import which is used for prohibited items. So I think I'm on the same track as you. I think it's a reasonable approach, and I think one shouldn't go too far. One must have sense of what is possible and reasonable.
Could I follow up, please? Very briefly. Yes, thank you. So then do you think that as far as, again, breaking the impasse is concerned and reinserting monitors into Iraq, that the important thing to do is to, on one hand, explain very clearly and carefully that Iraq has been qualitatively disarmed, that the means of mass producing weapons of mass destruction with any sort of quality has already been taken care of by the UNSCOM inspectors, and that therefore the next step is to re-implement ongoing monitoring and verification. But it's very important to lay out how Iraq has been qualitatively disarmed, and then supplement that by changing the criteria for disarmament.
I think
that was a hard one.
I think it's a very wise approach, and I hope that was something I outlined in the end of my presentation, stating that the deal I talked about was precisely that one should establish a control system which guarantees that the import and the export-import regime, I didn't mention that, but you were good enough to mention that specifically, is a key element in that. And Iraq indeed went along with that. I negotiated every aspect myself with Iraq, and it was full agreement between our two sides. Even if some members of the council were suspicious, it entered into force.
Do you think that Iraq has been qualitatively disarmed? Qualitatively, not quantitatively, but qualitatively. As you're no longer a weapons inspector.
Only 3 questions for a customer.
Yes, but I think it's...
no, you can complete your comment.
Yes. Well, I don't want to answer the pointed question as such. I would say that we felt that in all the areas we have eliminated Iraq's capabilities fundamentally. There are some question marks left, and that's why I think we should take a new track by the way I proposed it, which is to continue to establish a sharp controlling regime which prevents the build-up of new weapons. I think according to the line you were speaking, so I think we were in agreement.
We have time for 2 short questions and short answers, so please consider.
My name is Stafford Clary. Mr. Cass, you were functioning with the weapons side of the UN program. I was with the humanitarian side since I graduated from the Kennedy School 10 years ago. I've been there since 1991. I am still there to an extent. I was with UNHCR, IRCU, UNOKI, and with Habitat. I'd like to set some balance here. I basically agree with you. We have a dilemma. The humanitarian situation is disastrous in the center and south. I've been working since 1993 in the north. It's never been so good. People will say they have never had it so good in their whole life. the North is thriving. If we say it's because of the per capita amount of 986 resources available, well, the South has, in addition to the lower per capita, they also have other resources available. They also do their smuggling, and it's quite successful. Because everything we buy in the North comes through the center and South. I can buy anything I need. We buy from Turkey. It comes from Dubai through Baghdad right up. I got a Land Cruiser a year ago, less than here within 1 week. Everything is available. 986 works. It works in the North. It does not work in the center and South. I was in Baghdad for a couple of years. I chose to work in the North because I could do something there. And it works. But we do have a dilemma. Iraqis really feel. The Iraqis in the North feel for their brothers and sisters in the center and South. But they also fear the lifting of sanctions because they are afraid that what has happened to them already could easily happen again, and they are easily threatened. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's a very good, another view of a complex landscape. Please, this lady is next. You've been very patient, and I thank you. Short answer.
My name is Andrea Bremen. I'm kind of a non-specialist in any area, so I'm afraid my question is a bit more fundamental for you. And it's just, what is the nature of the sanctions themselves? Are they... that wasn't one of my... That wasn't a choice I was going to offer. I was going to offer...
Please.
Are they either...
Speak a little closer to the microphone.
Are they meant to be a punishment? Are they meant to be a censure to keep him from continuing on in power? Or are they meant to promote change from within? Or is the nature of them changed? I just coming from as I said, a non-specialist area, I'm trying to understand why they were put in place and what their specific purpose was to begin with.
Yes, well, we are back to this. I used the word carrot and stick. When it was put into place, there were the sanctions, or the oil embargo was as in reaction on the invasion of Kuwait. Intention was that the oil embargo should compel Saddam to withdraw from Kuwait or make a deal around Kuwait. That didn't hold, or people were not patient enough, so it became a war, and the sanctions were kept. And they were kept for both the purposes. One was obviously to say, if you do the right thing with regard to the weapons, the embargoes should be lifted. If you give up your weapons, embargoes. But it was also an element, I think, of punishment. As long as you don't do it, they should be there, and we should press you to do the right thing. So that is a dual side of the sanctions. What we are discussing today is that a lot of people are squeezed in there between. There may be even some, it was mentioned, who thinks that even if Iraq does everything which is right, it will not be allowed to be eased because of the problem with the leader. But this is something which I said is outside the United Nations context. We do not defend that policy. So, but it has both purposes. It is a promise to Iraq. It should be a promise to Iraq, and it is in the resolution. It's a promise to Iraq to get rid of the sanctions if Iraq gives up its weapons completely.
On that note, thank you very much. Good.
was afraid to